Good afternoon and welcome to our podcast, The Debunkers. I'm Tamara Hammond. My background includes a PhD in world languages and cultures, master's in Russian, and bachelor's in history. And my co-host, Anna Mace, has a bachelor's in finance, but she's mostly known with her book, Tax Me If You Can, from 2021. Today's topic is very controversial. We're going to talk about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And Mace is an expert since her roots are both in Russia and Ukraine. She grew up in Russia, but she has close relatives in Ukraine currently. So she has firsthand knowledge of it, and she's been following the conflict way before 2022. So
yes, Tamara, thank you. This is a very sensitive subject, like you said, and especially for people like myself who, I would like to make a correction because I grew up between Russia and Ukraine. So I was growing up in Ukraine with my grandparents since I was 1 to about 5 when I went back and lived with my parents in Moscow suburbs. Okay. So my first years, my first daycare and so forth, my first life was in Ukraine, in central Ukraine. So this is going to be an important geographical location within Ukraine are important points here, because if some people don't understand and don't realize the geography of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine is very different from Western Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainians might not like to hear this now, but it's the truth and they know that. So I grew up, this is a long time ago, obviously more than 40 years ago, that it was happening in the 70s, completely different times, of course, than now, during the Soviet Union, where it was one country and people lived in peace and harmony. And nobody could foresee or imagine, even remotely, a war between these nations, because these nations, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the Belarusians, are all part of one Slavic group of people. So we are all ethnically related. We're all ethnically the same. And they will argue differently right now because they've been re-educated lately, so to speak, and I call it brainwash. They will say they're closer to the Europeans, to the Poles, and so forth. But if you research that, we are all part of the Eastern Slavic group.
Correct. Even there are tribes of Bulgarians that come from Ukraine, so they have all kinds of Slavic traits in their blood. But let me clarify one thing. When you say central Ukraine, I know that Eastern Ukraine is mostly populated by Russians. What about Western Ukraine? I mean, Western Ukraine is more succumbed to Western influence, certainly. But what about Central Ukraine? Is it kind of in between?
Yes. So during the Soviet times, and talking about our differences between Russians and Ukrainians was not a politically correct subject. During those times, they tried to avoid discussing differences. They tried to make an emphasis on unity, on togetherness, and it worked because it resulted in peace and harmony. Even though in central Ukraine, most people spoke Russian, on the streets, at work, everywhere, the most common language was Russian.
Was the official language, right?
Yes.
The media, the schools, they all taught Russian.
There were Ukrainian schools too. Okay. Both languages were recognized and allowed by the state. So there was no discrimination of any kind. If you want to go to a Ukrainian school, there were theatrical performances, cultural, activities in both languages. So to appease and to welcome everyone, basically. So it worked in multicultural societies like that. It worked really well back then because it allowed for a representation of each culture, right? So in central Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine, the most widely spoken language was Russian. However, and I've never been to Western Ukraine, but we did know that if you go to Western Ukraine, you better not sound like they call it Moskal. Moskal is a reference to a Muscovite but it's a degrading reference. It's a bad name. Moskal is like not so cool. So if even back then, if you go to the streets of Lviv, the western capital of Ukraine, you know that you prefer to either speak Ukrainian or keep your mouth shut, even back then. So there were differences even back then. They were kept under the rug, so to speak. The old grudges between the Russians and the Ukrainians, they span a couple of centuries. They started in the 1800s with the Ukrainian nationalist movement. And the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the center of that was in Western Ukraine. So while the Central and the Eastern Ukraine were more intermingled and intermarried with the Russians, so to speak, Western Ukraine tried to stay isolated, not isolated, but ethnically Ukrainian. So this is where there was a big difference even back then. And of course, that difference did not disappear going forward, so to speak. So in my family, I am Russian. All my aunts, Russian aunts, married Ukrainian guys. So the Ukrainian uncles that I have, out of 3 of them, 2 of them were Ukrainian nationalists. This is how I am familiar with the movement. I am familiar with the roots of that. I know firsthand what they stand for. And at this point, one of these uncles is dead, and the other one is old. Even, with his hatred towards Russia, his entire life, even during Soviet Union, he had his grudges. He would speak at home, of course, not outside, but at home, he would express his discontent with the Russians. He would use the nationalist propaganda saying that Ukraine feeds the entire Soviet Union, which was not the case because economically, Ukraine was always subsidized, even though they are the breadbasket and they are a very fertile and wonderful agricultural country that anything grows in. However, economically, they were still subsidized by the Soviet Union. But this misinformation was already taking place back then. And of course, the memory of Holodomor. So Holodomor happened, the
famine, yeah.
The famine 30s, and it didn't happen only in Ukraine. This is so the Holodomor was a very unfortunate famine where millions of people died. But they didn't only die in Ukraine. They died in Russia, in the Northern Caucasus, in Moldova, in Kazakhstan. So people were dying because of, well, let's put it this way, Soviet mismanagement, perhaps. It's a combination of bad crops, several years of bad crops, and mismanagement, which resulted in this tragedy. But the Ukrainians, of course, blamed the Soviet government. Stalin was in charge. So Stalin was a Georgian who was in charge. However, somehow that hatred was always directed towards Russians. The Russians were always to blame for all the misfortunes of Ukraine, including this.
I believe the grudge was mixed, but mostly against the communist regime, because the other satellites of Eastern European countries, for example, Bulgaria, we also held a grudge towards the regime, not necessarily Russians and Russian culture, which we loved and we still do, just the communist regime. And I think it's connected to the famine as well, because that was the first 5-year government plan when they had the forced cooperatives. They forced people to turn in their lands and make big cooperatives. And
that's correct.
That was part of the problem.
That's correct. So the grudge was against the communist regime, but once again, the communist regime fell apart in 1991. However, the grudge never died. So it just carried on to Russia. So Russia, as successor of the Soviet Union, became the target of that grudge. Unfortunately, those memories continued. So this is how my uncle explained to me that his mother only survived because she hid in the dungeon with some grain to sustain herself. Otherwise, she would have died of famine too. So I understand this. I understand these horrible memories. But while during the Soviet Union, they were not necessarily suppressed, but maintained, this is a very fertile soil to grow hatred from. This is a very fertile ground to grow on these old grudges if you try to stir them up a little bit if needed. And this was needed in the 90s and on. And this is what basically led to the current nationalism in Ukraine, nationalist movement backed by the Western powers, of course, the CIA as the 50-year-old project, a 50-year-old plus project that was happening in Ukraine. Ukraine was a target, a very smart target of the West and mostly the CIA, of course. Why? Because they knew, as you know the old saying, divide and conquer always works, and it works magic if you can actually manage it to your advantage. So I would like to show, and my relatives will deny this. They will deny either due to lack of knowledge or due to whitewashing and just denying it, period, because it's inconvenient. And people will deny inconvenient facts, even though they're true, but unfortunately, it doesn't sound very comfortable to them. So they might deny it, but these are Western sources. This is not
Western propaganda.
They might accuse me, some people might accuse me of spreading propaganda, but these are the Western sources. So I would like to share with you.
So are we talking about the CIA project that started in the 80s and continues until?
Yes. So unfortunately, I can't upload it right now, but the American magazine Politico published an article. This was published back in 2022 after the war broke out. So the article says, and I'm going to read from the article to you, that this project called the Red Sox involved a number of unmarked flights that were launched from Central Europe into Western Ukraine. They dropped a handful of commandos in Western Ukraine, and their mission was, I'll read to you from the magazine, the American trained commandos would feed intelligence back to their handlers using new radio and communication equipment, stoking nationalist movements in Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Baltics. The goal was to provide the US unprecedented insight into Moscow's designs in Eastern Europe and, if possible, to help crack apart the Soviet Empire itself. I'm going to repeat again, if possible, to help crack apart the Soviet Empire itself. This was the mission.
And what year are we talking about? What year was that?
This is 1949.
Wow. So that was 2 years after the founding of the CIA. So they started right away with their. Okay.
Because the Soviet Union, this is the beginning of Cold War, and the Soviet Union was the only potential, contender to the empire, the American empire. So they immediately started targeting it. The next mission magazine, it's actually a research paper. And the abstract says between 1949 and 1953, CIA's Munich operations base airdropped 12 agents into Western Ukraine with pretty much the same instructions to gather intelligence and assist the local partisan movement. The project was called Aerodynamic. So all of these 12 people, except for one, were captured or killed. So they didn't succeed during the Soviet times. However, the project continued, and of course, it took off immediately after the Soviet Union fell apart. And in 1991, Ukraine became independent. This was the perfect time to start and restart this movement once again, the nationalistic movement. Why was it so important for the Americans, the CIA, and the West to continue? Because the Soviet Union fell apart, and supposedly they put down their arms and surrendered. So why continue? Why continue to target Russia at this point, right? Well, apparently, Russia, as successor of the Soviet Union, which was promised, as you know, that NATO wouldn't expand, that, now it was all peace and friendship between the West and Russia and so forth. Of course, they later found out in the early 2000s that the West didn't mean it. They did not mean any of that. And the Cold War continued, apparently. Even though the other side put down the arms and surrendered, apparently they were still not welcomed into the club.
Well, they were looking for a reason for the NATO to continue to exist, because NATO was supposed to be disintegrated as was the Warsaw Pact. The moment the Warsaw Pact went away,
which should have been the condition. The Warsaw Pact disintegrated on its own voluntarily without any negotiation with the NATO saying, hey, if we disarm and we disintegrate, you guys need to do the same. Only mutually we should accomplish this goal of peace and prosperity. But of course, that wasn't the case. And
NATO never went away. And NATO to this day continues to sow insurrections in these countries. They were very successful with former Yugoslavia. They had a civil war there. So many people died just to justify NATO's existence. And they continue now with Ukraine. They did with Georgia. They did the same incitement of insurrections there.
I think it's called the purple revolution. So all of these color revolutions that they instigated, including Ukraine, two there, 2004 and 2014, one in Georgia, one in Egypt, all of these led
to Libya, all these countries.
All of these countries led to regime changes to their liking. So when you need a regime change, you instigate, and you do that very quietly through opening of multiple NGOs, non-government organizations that function under the premise of, we're here to help out, to grow our cultural relations and so forth. Next thing you know, they're stoking nationalism. And what does nationalism normally lead to? Let's talk about nationalism, because nationalism to some people sounds good, like, I'm very proud. I'm a very proud Ukrainian, just like my uncles were banging on their chest, and screaming they're very proud nationalists, and okay, so what does that entail? Nationalism, right? So nationalism in Ukraine, and historically, it always led to the same, like during World War II, where it led to integrating with the Nazis. Basically, nationalism in Ukraine led to Nazism. So they were part of the Nazi regime. They had a Galicia unit battalion within the Nazi forces in Western Ukraine. It's a known fact. It's historical fact. Anybody can look this up. It got revitalized again in the 90s.
Yeah, their national hero, Banderas, he was responsible for so many genocidal deaths of Jewish people, Slavs, Poland, Polish people.
He became the Ukraine's national hero. I don't recall exactly the year, 2012 or 2014, but they declared him their national hero. When I asked my Russian aunt, whose father, my grandfather, fought during World War II. He walked the entire Europe by foot. He fought for the entire duration of the war. He was wounded twice.
On the Russian side?
Of course, on the Russian side. If he was captured by the Bandera and his Galicia division, he would have been tortured to death. I mean, these guys didn't just kill. They tortured people horribly. In fact, even the Nazis, the German Nazis, were surprised by the level of barbarism and cruelty of these people. So to make this Bandera person their national hero, I asked my aunt, well, how do you feel about this? And I think by this point, these people got so brainwashed and so confused. They got so confused already as to who is hero and who is not hero. And she said, well, it's complicated. Well, how is it complicated? Your own father would have been like skinned alive by these people. They would have skinned him alive and cooked him and tortured him. What are you talking about? So there was a lot of confusion as far as, who is hero, who is not hero in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainian nationalism has this very dangerous tendency to cross that line and go into fascism. And
they only use the swastika. The swastika sign is all over. Zelensky was up in a picture with Bandera and the swastika. It's very scandalous, but they're trying to cover it up. Our media, Western media.
Well, the Western media prior to 2022 wasn't really trying to cover it up. They were open about it, and you would see a headline here and there, not too many, but you would see the headlines. Because some of these people were training foreigners, like Americans, like Australians, like people from New Zealand. They were training Nazis on the Ukrainian soil. So the domestic agencies like the FBI here, they were very concerned because they don't want these Nazis to come back here. They don't want this happening here, but they're okay for it to be happening there in Ukraine to fight the Russians. This is perfect. This actually serves a great purpose for them, right?
Committing terrorist acts all along towards the eastern regions of Donetsk and Lugansk. They've been throwing bombs and shelling people there and killing people for a long, long time, way before 1922.
So I'll tell you a story, basically. So the Ukrainians, and I've been to Ukraine, I flew into Kiev in 2007. I was traveling through to go to Moscow. So I stopped in Kiev first. And on the plane, when I was flying into Ukraine, I flew with the Ukrainian woman sitting next to me. So we struck a conversation. And in this conversation, she explained to me that she was a businesswoman, and she was crying, basically explaining how corrupt Ukraine was, how the authorities are draconian, when it comes to bribery, that she has a hard time surviving, and she might have to possibly immigrate to the United States, even if she doesn't want to, but they're just not letting her do business in peace. So we're talking about the Ukrainian corrupt, police, different agencies, that come and take bribes and so forth. The Ukrainians somehow attributed all this, and I think this is with the help of their media, of course, and different NGOs like by George Soros, who was really, really anti-Soviet, anti-Russian as successor, just like the CIA, but as an individual billionaire who can sponsor and spend his money however he wants. So he was basically setting up all these NGOs, and they would influence, of course, the media, because that's how you brainwash people. That's how you brainwash the crowds. So somehow the Ukrainians attributed that, even though they were they were a separate country, they had nothing to do with Russia. The relationship between Russia and Ukraine at that time in 2007 was already so sour and so bad, but the current president was still trying to keep neutrality, because they knew if they would swing one way or the other, they were going to instigate a trouble. Their only purpose and their only way to keep peace was to stay neutral. However, these constant media bombardments, comparing and linking corruption and the government to Russia, blaming Russia for their own internal corruption, led to, and we need to move towards the West. We need to integrate with the West. The West is our only answer. The West is where we belong. We belong with Europe. We belong with America. And of course, those were good dreams, perhaps, right? But they just didn't know the price that it would cost them. They didn't know what Europe and America actually wanted out of them for that dream.
Correct. And we know now, because of leaked information, that they were all along they were after the resources of Ukraine. We have Senator Lindsey Graham saying out loud that there are minerals at the tune of $1 trillion, and he's talking to his fellow senators, and he said, we are not going to let Putin get this. It's ours. So.
It's been sold, all of these resources, even though Ukrainians continue to die for them and they think it's their soil, but their soil where they have no rights, basically. So they're dying for BlackRock Corporation. They're dying for these people who own this soil. They actually invested, and they will fight probably till the end to keep those resources. Correct.
The last Ukrainian, that's the saying. We'll fight to the last Ukrainian.
Correct. Unfortunately, people in Ukraine have not woken up yet. They don't have access to this information, nor do they speak English really to understand what's happening here. They're very politically uneducated. It's very it's almost bizarre, my conversations with my relatives as to what, since I've lived here most of my life and I worked for the US government, and I know how they function, I know how they're structured, I know how they will not invest $1 into any project without expecting a huge reward on that money. So for them to claim that this is not a proxy war, we have not been manipulated, we have not been used, we are, fighting for our freedom, we're fighting for our democracy. In fact, we're actually protecting the world against Putin. So all of these statements have no basis based on what I know, because I know who owns this war. I know who instigated the war. I know who funded all these projects and all these movements in Ukraine. So in 2022, in February, I knew this was going to be a really, really bad story for Ukraine and for Russia too, because a lot of Russians are dying. This is a graveyard. Ukraine has become a graveyard for the Slavic people.
Ukraine is being sacrificed. It's gonna cease to exist, and it's gonna be looted by Western powers and maybe divided between Russia and the West. But Ukraine, in all cases, it's gonna lose.
This was a losing battle from the beginning. So I don't know how it's going to end. And I don't applaud Russian strategies and the way they're handling this. I don't applaud. I don't support the war the way it's been conducted and the way it started. Of course, there were so many issues besides the Ukrainian nationalism, the problem in Donbass and Luhansk. Of course, Ukrainian Nazis burned Russian people alive in Odessa, several dozens in 2014. This was not very much televised here in the West, but there was some news. Besides that, the CIA was training Ukrainian operatives in Eastern Ukraine as we speak. I'm talking about right across the fence, right over the fence with Russia. The Ukrainian army was being trained by the American army and CIA operatives. This is not just pure hearsay. It's been documented in multiple sources, and I can actually quote some of them, because this is very important. So Ukrainian.
So in 2014, ousted democratically elected President Yanukovych, and he had to flee the country because of the insurgents and all the insurrections in the country. That was orchestrated by the CIA and American Undersecretary Victoria Nuland.
Let's pause here for a second and let's touch base on the work of Ukrainian, Canadian political scientist and a professor at University of Ottawa, Ivan Kachanovsky. This professor wrote a book, and he did a very extensive research into the Maidan massacre of 2014. And he interviewed multiple eyewitnesses from both the protesters and the police. He used video and photo evidence, and he basically argued that the majority of protesters and police were shot by snipers located in buildings and areas that were under the control of Maidan opposition forces. This false flag theory suggests the violence was deliberately orchestrated to escalate the conflict and ultimately lead to the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. His book is published. It's on Amazon. It's called The Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, the mass killing that changed the world. So this is a well-documented book, a well-documented study, and whoever wants to dispute that needs to read basically the book and see the evidence that's cited in this book.
Correct.
So therefore, that leads us back to who took over Ukraine once Yanukovych was ousted. So Yanukovych was not a good president. I have to admit that. He was unpopular. He was not very effective. In fact, I believe that he basically semi-retired while in position and delegated a lot of tasks to his son and some of the politicians there. And basically the country, the corruption was always there, and it was just not working out well for the people of Ukraine. So this was a perfect opportunity for the Maidan to happen. However, who took over Ukraine once that happened? My relatives don't know who Victoria Nuland is. Living in Ukraine their entire lives and being actually run by Victoria Nuland, being governed by her from 2014 on, they still don't know, and a lot of Ukrainians didn't know and still don't know. And this is quite it's amazing to me, because a lot of Americans know who she is, and a lot of Americans know that she's the one who instigated this conflict, and she's the one who came to power in Ukraine, even though they held general elections and voted for Poroshenko, a Ukrainian, obviously, who became the president, but he was just a puppet of the U.S. State Department. Victoria Nuland was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs from 21 to 24, and from 2013 to 17, she was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She was also the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2005 to 2008. A coincidence. So once she came to power in Ukraine, there were evidence such as videos and phone calls that were recorded back then that implicate her and put her in a position where she gave orders. She gave appointments to who is going to be the mayor of Kiev. She was making the decisions, the main decisions. So Ukraine lost its sovereignty in 2014, not to Russia, but to the West, to Victoria Nuland. And Victoria Nuland explicitly stated that the European allies, so to speak, were going to be sidelined and not included in the decision-making process in Ukraine. So it was only the United States that was going to make decisions from that point on. My family members do not believe this. They believe this is Russian propaganda, while a lot of Americans know this as a fact, because her video and her phone calls have been leaked on so many platforms, and those are, and she hasn't denied it.
Yeah, you should tell your relatives to watch the documentary by Oliver Stone. It's called Ukraine on Fire. There are two series, 2014 and 2015.
Yeah, they're going to tell me that this is also Russian propaganda. And also, I don't believe they have full access to media that unwanted info like that.
That's correct, because Elon Musk provides their internet.
Not because of this. I think their security forces block unwanted videos. So even though they have access to YouTube, but when I try to send certain information to them, those don't come through. And other videos do come through. So certain pieces are being blocked. They're being monitored. And if somebody wants to insist and believe that Ukraine is a free and democratic society, they're either brainwashed as well and have no idea. But I know firsthand knowledge, because once again, I tried to send these pieces of information that were not going through to my family members. So They don't know who Gonzalo Lira he was killed by the Ukrainian security forces. He was a journalist. He had an American citizenship, but I think he was from Latin America originally. And he reported on all of these atrocities by the compromised Ukrainian government. And he was captured and killed, tortured and killed by the Ukrainian forces. So don't tell me that Ukraine is a free society, that it has free media and freedom of speech. None of that is true. In fact, I'll tell you more. The Ukrainians, they want to associate and they want to be close to the Europeans. They want to be part of that European family where, the law and the order rules. However, historically, unfortunately, the Russians and the Ukrainians are the same people, and that cultural background and cultural baggage exist and they're the same. And even though their government banned the Russian language in public institutions in 2019, completely banned, they changed the Ukrainian names. So my aunt was Aunt Tatiana, and then she became Aunt Tetiana. They changed the spelling. My cousin Vlad, he became Volodymyr, just like Volodymyr Zelensky, who was Vladimir, then he became Volodymyr. When this happened, that the last straw, I think they pushed, and I knew at this point, perhaps the war was inevitable, because the divide and conquer was playing out just perfectly. Divide and conquer. And the Ukrainians, they didn't know why their names changed, but I think on the more ethnic Russian side, in the eastern Ukraine, these people became outraged. And when you have a large minority like that, statistically it's 17.9%, but they're mostly in the eastern and southern Ukraine. So if you're going to tell my 60-year-old aunt that she's going to be Tatiana versus Tatiana, she might object and say, no, I don't want to be. All my life I've been Tatiana. Who are you to tell me what my name is going to be spelled like now? My other relative was a professor at the university in Mariupol. One day she came to work, and they never spoke Ukrainian at work. They always taught in Russian, and she was elderly. So one day coming to work, she was told that she is no longer allowed to teach in Russian, but she had to switch to Ukrainian, which even in technical terms, in her specialty, it was almost impossible, because there was no way for her to manage that. So these people with these changes were not only upset, but outraged. And for Europeans who so much value their minorities, who so much give them freedoms, for example, in Spain very much supports current Ukraine and the Ukrainian government in its fight against Russia. But I will tell you that when you go to the Basque region, that's a minority, right? In the Basque region, the entire area is in Basque language. So all the signs in the street are in Basque language. Basque language is the dominant language. This is how the local governments and the locals speak their native language, and Spanish is their second language. So both languages are allowed. If you go to the Catalan region in Barcelona and the surrounding areas, those people speak Catalan, and nobody in the Spanish government would even fathom taking that right from these people. Yet in Ukraine, the Western imposed government, the puppet government of Zelensky, decides to take that right away and impose their language. And some younger Ukrainians say, well, we need to know our national identity. We need to know but what about those people? What about their rights? How come? So, I believe the puppet masters took all of these steps to
divide and conquer,
and push to the point of inevitable. And of course, perhaps the war could have been avoided and all these issues left neglected, or perhaps there was a better timing in history, or a better situation, or a better strategy. That's a whole different discussion. But this
perfectly avoidable. The war was perfectly avoidable. It was imposed on purpose, and the Ukrainians are gonna pay the price, and the Russians.
And the Russians. The Ukrainian tragedy is not only the Ukrainian tragedy, it's the Russian tragedy as well. I don't know how many died, but so many died on both sides. It's a graveyard for Slavic men, and I only see them as one because I grew up with both. To me, they're all brothers. To me, they're all our people. And for them to die in such a horrible and really stupid war is not, it's beyond words.
Like our civil war, when brother went against brother, it's just killing relatives. That's what.
Well, and there are some families that actually fight against one another. So you have a father on the Russian side and a son on the Ukrainian side. It's a horrible tragedy for so many people. And for some people to think that the West cares. The West doesn't care. You have to understand that all that money is given to you not because they're nice guys and they want to help you. No, you are doing their dirty work. You're doing their dirty work, and I know your land is being invaded. It's a valid argument. I understand that. And perhaps it could have been avoided. I don't know. But you're not defending your land anymore. This land has been sold. And we can do another session where I can show you on the map what parts and what resources have been sold. But I do know that Trump signed with Zelensky an agreement where pretty much all of the minerals and the riches of that soil. So, you might own that land, or you might conquer it back and fight back against the Russians, but all the riches of that land have already been sold. So you can only then maybe be a serviceman for the owners, or for the real owners of that land.
That's a known fact. And on this note, we have to wrap it up. Do you have any hope for the future? How do you predict this will end?
Tamara, it can go two ways, one or the other. One way is the West might accomplish its goal and split Russia, just like they were able to do with the Afghan war in the Soviet Union, because the Afghan war was a graveyard for the Soviet soldiers, and it ended badly. And basically, ultimately, it led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So if that continues and the war is prolonged, just like the West wants, because the Western goals right now are to prolong the war, even though you might hear and trust that Trump will stop the war, and I hope and pray that that's the case. And if that's the case,
not stopping the war, no.
Unfortunately, all evidence points in the opposite direction, and it looks like the war is going to be prolonged. And unfortunately, from what I hear from Romania, is that Romania is being prepared by the NATO to be involved in this war, as the Europe is preparing to enter the war in a couple of years or sooner. And if that's the case, then God help Russia and God help Ukraine. By that time, how many more millions of Russians and Ukrainians will die? God knows.
So we are headed to World War III then, if Romania is going to be involved and other...
Well, it really is already a World War III, because multiple countries already are involved, even though they're not officially signed up in this war. But by all means, they are in the war, and all evidence seems to point in the direction that they will continue, and they have no intentions of stopping.
I wish we had more good news, but on that note, unfortunately, we have to end the session, and we'll have another one, as you mentioned, on Ukraine and the future of Russia. So we'll continue the discussion.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and goodbye. Until next time.